But times change, and so must I.
I know these teeth.
Oh, hello.
Why don't you just die?
So, Doctor Who has just wrapped up its second season. Well, sort of the third second season. It's received rampant criticism, and to be honest, for good reason. The general consensus is that what was a fairly strong season with some fairly interesting ideas and themes ended on an incredibly flat note. The final two-parter has been noted by, I think, pretty much everyone who's seen it as being lazy and poorly written, with season-long plot threads being randomly ditched and unexplored, and a general feeling of the whole finale just being very, very rushed. There are a lot of criticisms that Season 2 has, I think, rightfully deserved, and if I was to talk about all of my individual gripes with the current showrunning decisions, this video would be sort of insanely long. So while yes, I do certainly think that there are a number of various writing issues which have meant this new reboot of Doctor Who is not the best, I think the folly of the show's last season highlights an issue with this new era of the show as a whole, and what I would argue is the biggest problem the show has been facing recently. That, as you've guessed by the title of this video, is Doctor Who's nostalgia baiting problem. Back in 2022, when Jodie Whittaker regenerated into what is our now third version of David Tennant, and it was announced he would be briefly returning for the show's 60th anniversary specials, everything seemed well. On paper, you would have a set of returning faces for the celebration of the show's incredibly long history, and then when the new Ncuti Gatwa Doctor arrives and gets his own season, you have a chance to pivot away from all that and focus on ushering the show into a new era which stands up on its own. And this seemed to be what the plan was. In fact, showrunner Russell T Davies essentially sold this whole new reboot as a new era which would be defined by a sense of moving forward. He constantly referred to his second tenure on the show as being fresh, and the decision to start again number-wise for the seasons was also a result of this. And for many fans, both casual and die-hard, this seemed like a very solid idea. After quite a messy few years, the notion of starting anew to accommodate new viewers was, in mine and I think a lot of people's opinions, a brilliant idea. You could keep the core values and ideas of the first 60 years of the show, but move on with refreshing new stories for people to enjoy. It's perfect, really. Those who have watched it for a long time won't feel like they're caught in a loop of watching the same thing over and over again, and new or returning more casual fans could watch without having to catch up on hundreds of different episodes. For a lot of people, this was why the original reboot back in 2005 worked so well. It was still distinctly Doctor Who and famously utilised many recognisable elements from the classic era of the show. However, there are two key differences between that reboot and this one. The reason that episodes with returning monsters or characters largely worked originally was because they, well, worked on their own. You didn't need to know what a Dalek was or who the Master was, and while it was cool if you did, it wasn't necessary to the storytelling. Then, this new reboot started implementing a lot of legacy characters, which seems strange already considering the whole point of rebooting the show was to give it a bit of a fresh start. However, initially it was fine because it felt like this was going to be done in a manner similar to what had happened in 2005 onwards, that the more historical elements of the show would be used as a means to both advance the plot of an episode and mesh multiple eras of the show together. This, however, was quickly revealed to not be the case. Instead, there's this strange insistence on reviving legacy characters in the new reboot, just for them to not really do anything, or, I think even worse, act completely differently to how we would know them. Which begs the question, and the problem I think the reboot is facing at the minute, why bring someone back if they have nothing to do with their character? The simple answer is the issue the title of this video raises, that nostalgia baiting has become a key component of Doctor Who's writing. The whole reboot is littered with this problem, but I think Season 2 for a lot of people, and me, was a particular display of just how bad this has got. Especially when it comes to the characters of the Rani and Omega. I genuinely believe there is no reason for either of those characters to be there, and they demonstrate the show's biggest problem in relation to this reliance on nostalgia. Legacy characters are there for no reason other than for people to go, hey look, it's the guy from that one episode. The Rani does nothing. She's set up as the major villain for the season, but does essentially nothing until she randomly reveals herself to two one-off characters at the end of an episode about Eurovision. Then, after controlling the world for all of about 5 minutes, she summons Omega, is eaten by him immediately, and then the other version of her just vanishes out of the show entirely. Why go through all the trouble of bringing this character back, providing a forced-in exposition dump at the end of an episode that's had basically nothing to do with her, all for the sake of immediately rendering this entire character useless? Omega himself is even more ridiculous. He is name-dropped randomly in the penultimate episode and is teased as the big new threat of the finale. Then he shows up and is killed by a laser and just never seen again. So why was he there? Why revive a character from a story from 1973 if you're not even going to do anything with him? Apart from, of course, the same old thing of a fan can go, oh wow, Omega, I've heard of him, so I'll have to keep watching. Even Mel is a prime example of this. I initially presumed her inclusion in the 60th specials was a mere celebration of the show's history, but then they kept bringing her back for each season finale. Now, I did think it was odd to reintroduce a character from when the BBC were desperately trying to kill the show, and viewing numbers were a famous low, but I thought, okay, whatever. Then, in any scene she's in, she just stands around in the background, literally doing nothing. Oh, and then when she meets the Rani again, probably her biggest enemy, the two have a catch-up chat for 2 minutes and then just never speak or interact in any way again. This reunion is completely pointless because it lacks any kind of impact or bearing on either the plot or either character. Once again, it's just another cheap throwback for people who recognise either of them to gawp at. And this isn't me blaming those people, because I got excited when those two met. But it's very surface level. As soon as it's over, you just think, why on earth did that even happen? What should have been a new, fresh take on the series quickly felt like a collection of meaningless references for people who might have seen the Sixth Doctor's run, and subsequently this all felt disinteresting. In fact, every major plot thread or weird little tease in this new era of the show has relied on a name which a lot of fans are only either somewhat familiar with, or won't have a clue about. And in fairness, why would they? It's very important to remember that a huge reason seasons 5 and 6 get a lot of praise is because the arc of each season was new. While there were returning monsters throughout the seasons, the running plot thread and the subsequent finales of both were unique and fresh stories, which naturally made them more interesting. Whether you like those episodes or not, you can admit they were at least gripping because it was hard to tell where it was going. Whereas now it's become incredibly predictable. And if the show does survive and makes it to a new season 3, it feels like it's just going to end with a battle between a recognisable name and a recognisable name, which is, of course, incredibly boring. But it's what's happened the last 2 times. And it's also integral to note that some of the initial reboot's highest rated episodes critically were those featuring new ideas, monsters and themes, showing that fresh ideas are obviously effective and are really enjoyed by the fans. People aren't after a recognisable name popping up every episode just so they can go, oh wow, I know who that is. People want interesting new stories, not the same old thing. Now, on paper, I obviously have no issue with bringing back legacy characters, as some of my favourite episodes of New Who are ones which utilise classic villains, and obviously, if done effectively, using recognisable characters can be a great way of maintaining the show's identity. In both World Enough in Time and The Doctor Falls, the Cybermen aren't there just so you can go, oh wow, the Cybermen. They're integral to character development and the plot of each episode. The appeal of Doctor Who to a lot of people is that it changes and moves on. You literally have a protagonist who changes face every couple of years and travels with someone new every year or so. You care about returning characters when they show up, because they're written to be, for the most part, interesting, regardless of if you've seen them before. For example, when Sarah Jane returned in Season 2, you cared for her because the show not only explained her relationship with the Doctor in a manner which wasn't just through a flashback, but also made her an interesting character again in her own right. And, again, she wasn't just there for the sake of being a name you recognise. She played a vital role in not only the episode's plot, but also in the characterisation of Rose, who learns in this episode that she's not the only companion the Doctor has travelled and formed meaningful relationships with. Having a quick reference to something isn't inherently a bad idea. As I said earlier, it's a nice way of honouring the show's history without detracting from the contemporary era. But when you have entire key plot points and entire seasons based around characters we've seen before, it just does get really boring. Doctor Who was once a show which, while, yes, full of callbacks and references, worked incredibly well as essentially a new show. Now it asks its viewers for an almost encyclopedic knowledge of the show's tenure, but that it doesn't even reward those people who are familiar with these things, because the callbacks never amount to anything valuable. So if you don't know who these people are, it's meaningless, and even if you do, it's meaningless. Then, in what I think you will agree is the most egregious example of nostalgia baiting in the show's history, the 15th Doctor regenerates into Billie Piper. Because what better way to keep people engaged in a fresh run of Doctor Who than to have the main character turn into one of the most recognisable companions in the show's history? Nothing says fresh like having an important character from 20 years ago come back in the title role. Having her take over the mantle of the Doctor is quite literally the polar opposite of moving on. It puts the audience in this time loop of revisiting 2005 to 2009 over and over and over again. A new Doctor is usually quite fun because it represents a new era of the show. New face, new adventures, a new character arc, new companions. Now, however, the Doctor is just a physical reminder of what many people consider to be the show's golden age. No one wants this, at least I don't. People want to see a new actor go on new adventures, keeping things fresh and alive. Not just the Doctor who now looks inexplicably like Rose fighting the Daleks again. Having Billie Piper take over the role barely even 2 years after we just had David Tennant again is so clearly nuts and lazy it doesn't even bear explaining. The Doctor just circling through old faces in itself is egregious. But I think the fact it's Rose, a fan favourite companion who was a part of many childhoods, just takes it to a new level of stupid, cheap nostalgia baiting. Now, I am the last person to defend the timeless child twist in Season 12. I think it ruins the character of the Doctor and the canon of the show for a number of reasons that I won't get into this video. However, the one thing I will give it credit for is it was at least an attempt to take the show in a new direction and just generally do something new. Yes, in execution, it was a pretty terrible idea, but it was at least a breath of fresh air, even if said air was made of acid. Essentially, I don't want Doctor Who to just sit around and remind me of when it was worth watching. I just want it to be worth watching. Now, I know this video has been quite ranty and has been a deviation from the usual kind of videos I do, and I'm being incredibly critical of Doctor Who, but the reason is because I do love the show and always have done. It's been a staple of my childhood as it has for many people, and I've witnessed some absolutely incredible highs and some truly awful lows. The thing is it does truly bug me that the same man who revived the series in such an effective manner all those years ago and delivered some of the most interesting, fresh takes on characters has resorted to quick, cheap references, all of which just constantly feels like it's RTD thinking that if people are reminded of when Doctor Who was good, they'll automatically like it again, which is obviously not how it works. I think ending this era of the show with the Doctor seemingly stuck in a loop of just revisiting the faces of fan favourite characters is actually a very poignant example of just how reliant RTD currently is on an innate need to nostalgia bait to try and keep the show relevant.
Doctor, I let you go.